Freedom felt like victory until the desert began to whisper. The Red Sea was behind them, the promised land was ahead, and the people were starving in the middle. They cried, "We should have stayed in Egypt." Can you relate? When God delivers you, but your needs still return every morning. When faith feels like failure. God is not finished, because the same God who rained bread from heaven is the same God who will provide for you today. Stay with me, because your miracle is closer than you think. The desert does not kill you immediately. That is its cruelty. It does not shout. It whispers. It waits. Day after day, it drains hope slowly. Not with sudden disaster, but with silence, with sameness, with endless horizons that never change. The sun rises. The sun sets. And nothing looks different. The desert stretches days until time itself feels heavy. Yesterday's miracle feels far away, like a dream you once had, but can no longer remember clearly. Tomorrow's promise feels impossible, not because God has failed, but because hunger has a louder voice than hope. That is where Israel stood, not in Egypt anymore. Not in the promised land yet. In between. Behind them, the Red Sea still whispered its story. They had walked through walls of water. They had seen the impossible bow before the power of God. They had watched their enemies disappear into the deep. But miracles fade quickly. When your stomach is empty. Around them was the wilderness. Wide, barren, unforgiving. No fields. No markets, no safety nets, only sand, only sky, only questions. Ahead of them was uncertainty. Not danger, uncertainty. And uncertainty is often more frightening than chains. They were free, but freedom had a cost. In Egypt they were slaves, but at least they knew what tomorrow looked like. In Egypt they had pain, but they also had routine. In Egypt they had oppression, but they had bread. Freedom removed their chains, but it also removed their control. Now they had to trust God. Not once, not occasionally, but daily. And that is the hardest kind of faith. Faith that trusts God when the sea opens is easy. Faith that trusts God when nothing happens. That is costly. The wilderness exposes what miracles often hide. It reveals whether we love God for who He is, or only for what He does. Israel stood between memory and promise, between deliverance and destiny, between what God had done and what He had yet to do. And the question hanging in the desert air was simple, but terrifying. Can we trust God when there is no miracle today? Because the wilderness is not where God abandons you. It is where He teaches you that He is enough. Just weeks earlier, they had witnessed the impossible. Not a story told by others. Not a rumor passed down through generations. They had seen it with their own eyes. Water had risen like walls. Not trickling, not parting slowly, but standing still, as if creation itself had frozen in obedience to God. The ground beneath their feet had been dry. Dry where it should have been death. Dry where fear should have swallowed them whole. They walked through what should have drowned them. Behind them their enemies chased. Armed, trained, ruthless. Once powerful. Once terrifying. But now those enemies were silent beneath the sea. The same waters that made a path for God's people became a grave for their oppressors. And Israel sang. They sang because fear had lost its grip. They danced because chains were gone. They believed, oh, they truly believed. God had proven Himself. But miracles fade faster than hunger. Celebration does not fill empty stomachs. Songs do not silence hunger pains. Dancing feet eventually grow tired. Day by day, the wilderness closed in. The sound of celebration gave way to the sound of empty stomachs. The joy of deliverance slowly dissolved into anxiety. The certainty of victory weakened into doubt. Faith, once loud and confident, began to whisper, and then fear found its voice again. Not the fear of Pharaoh, not the fear of the sea, but a quieter, deeper fear. What if God brought us out, but will not carry us through? The wilderness began asking questions. Their faith had not prepared them to answer. Questions without answers. Questions without signs. Questions without miracles. What will we eat? Because freedom does not remove hunger. It only changes who you trust to satisfy it. How long will this last? Because waiting is harder than running, and uncertainty feels heavier than chains. Did God bring us here to die? Because when pain returns, we begin to rewrite the story of deliverance. The same God who parted the sea now seemed silent, and silence is terrifying. In Egypt, suffering had a structure. In the wilderness, suffering had no timeline. In Egypt, tomorrow looked predictable. In freedom, tomorrow was unknown. And the people stood there, between memory and promise, between what God had done and what He had not yet explained. They had crossed the sea, but they had not yet learned how to trust God without a miracle. And that is where the real journey begins. Not when the waters part, but when nothing happens. Not when enemies fall, but when hunger rises. Because the wilderness does not mean God is gone. It means God is about to reveal a deeper kind of faith, one that does not depend on spectacle, but on trust. Exodus 16 does not open with praise. It opens with murmuring. Not prayer, not worship, not gratitude. Murmuring, a low, restless sound. The sound people make when disappointment has nowhere else to go. The people gathered together, not to lift their hands, but to point fingers, not to praise God, but to accuse Him. They stood before Moses and Aaron and said words so shocking, so painful, so revealing, that they echo through every generation. If only we had died in Egypt. Think about that. These were the same people who cried out for deliverance, the same people who begged God to rescue them from slavery, the same people who walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. Now they wished they had never left. Why? Because hunger has a way of rewriting history. They remembered Egypt, but not the whips. They remembered Egypt, but not the chains. They remembered Egypt, but not the cries of their children. They remembered the bread. They romanticized slavery, because at least slavery felt predictable. Chains were cruel, but they were familiar. Bondage was painful, but it was stable. Freedom, on the other hand, was terrifying, because freedom demanded trust. The wilderness has a strange power. It makes bondage look safe, and freedom look reckless. It convinces you that oppression with food is better than freedom with faith. This is the danger of the wilderness, when survival becomes the goal. Purpose feels like a luxury. Many people don't leave Egypt because they love slavery. They leave because they hate suffering. They leave because the pain becomes unbearable. They leave because the chains become too heavy. They leave because the cries become too loud. But when suffering follows freedom, when pain does not end immediately, they begin to doubt their decision. They ask, was this worth it? Did I make a mistake? Was I better off before? And slowly, quietly, dangerously, They want to go back. Back to what enslaved them. Back to what broke them. Back to what God rescued them from. Not because it was good, but because it was known. When freedom feels like failure, faith is tested at its deepest level. Because real freedom is not the absence of hardship. It is the presence of God in the hardship. And the wilderness was about to teach them this truth. God did not bring them out to abandon them. He brought them out to teach them how to live free. If God were impatient, this story would end in Exodus 16. If God were easily offended, the desert would have become their grave. If God loved perfection more than people, He would have walked away the moment they complained. But He didn't. God listened, not because the complaints were holy, but because the people were hungry. He did not deny their hunger. He did not dismiss their pain. He did not shame their weakness. He did not say, "After all I've done for you, how dare you speak this way?" He did not remind them of the sea. He did not replay the miracles. He did not demand gratitude before giving help. Instead, God leaned in. And Scripture says something tender, something revealing, something that exposes the heart of God. I have heard the complaints of the Israelites, not ignored, not silenced. Heard. God hears complaining hearts, not because He approves of the complaint, but because He loves the complainer. There is a difference. God does not celebrate unbelief, but He does not abandon the weak. He does not applaud doubt, but He does not turn away the hungry. Because God knows something we often forget. Behind every complaint is a fear that needs assurance. Behind every murmur is a heart that needs care. Behind every accusation is a soul afraid of being forgotten. And God answers fear, not with punishment, but with provision. Then God made a promise, not a lecture, not a warning, not a threat, a promise. I will rain bread from heaven. Bread, not gold, not weapons, not instant arrival in the promised land. Bread, because God always begins with what you need most. Bread from heaven, not earned, not bought, not produced by human hands. Given, and not once, not occasionally, not when they behaved well, but every day. Daily provision, for daily dependence. God did not say, "I will give you enough to never need me again." He said, "I will give you enough to trust me tomorrow." Because God was not just feeding bodies. He was rebuilding trust. He was teaching a wounded people, "I may not remove the wilderness immediately, but I will never leave you unfed in it." The desert would still be hot. The journey would still be long. The questions would still come. But hunger would not have the final word. Because the God who heard their cries in Egypt was still listening in the wilderness. The God who split the sea was now opening heaven. And this is the truth Exodus 16 whispers to every generation. God does not turn away when faith is fragile. He does not abandon you when fear speaks louder than praise. He does not stop providing because you struggle to believe. He hears, He cares, and He provides, one day at a time. God did not say, "I will give you a future harvest." He did not promise overflowing barns, or years of stored grain, or a lifetime guarantee written in the sand. He said something much simpler, much harder. "I will feed you today." Because God often works in daily portions, not lifetime guarantees. We want security. God wants trust. We want to know what next year will look like. God asks us to believe Him for tonight. We want storage, backup plans, savings, guarantees. God wants surrender, open hands, open hearts, daily dependence. The wilderness was not designed to starve Israel. It was designed to teach them how to trust, because a people who lived 400 years as slaves had learned how to survive under control, but they had not yet learned how to live by faith. And faith is learned one day at a time. The first morning. Imagine the dawn. The desert is quiet, not silent but still. The air is cool, a brief mercy before the sun becomes unbearable. The sand is damp with dew, tiny drops clinging to the ground like unanswered prayers. No sound of celebration, no sound of complaint, just waiting. As the sun begins to rise, something strange appears. Not dramatic, not loud, not glowing with fire. Something small, thin, white, flaky, scattered across the ground like frost. The people step closer. They kneel. They touch it, and confusion spreads across their faces. They ask one another a simple question. What is it? They don't recognize provision, because it doesn't look familiar. It doesn't look like Egyptian bread. It doesn't look like what they used to eat. It doesn't look like what they expected God to do. Often God's provision arrives in forms we don't immediately trust. We expect miracles that shout. God often provides in whispers. We expect abundance that overwhelms. God gives sufficiency that sustains. They asked, "What is this?" And God answered, "This is what I promised. Not what you imagined, not what you demanded, but what you need." Provision doesn't always look impressive. Sometimes it looks simple. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it looks like just enough. But just enough is still a miracle when it comes from heaven. That morning, they learned something life-changing. God may not feed your future all at once, but He will never let today go unfed. And every morning after that, they would wake up knowing He is still faithful. He is still present. He is still providing. One day at a time. God gave them a command, simple but revealing. Gather only what you need for today. Not for next week. Not for tomorrow. Not for the future you cannot see. For today. Some people gathered little. They moved slowly. They hesitated. They weren't sure what this strange bread would do. Others gathered much. They rushed. They feared scarcity. They remembered hunger too well. Different hands, different speeds, different fears. But the miracle did not depend on how much they gathered. Here is the wonder of heaven's economy. No one lacked. Those who gathered little had enough, not barely enough, not almost enough. Enough. Those who gathered much had no excess, nothing wasted, nothing hoarded, nothing missing. In God's kingdom, provision is not measured by accumulation, but by sufficiency. God was teaching them something deeper than survival. He was rewriting their understanding of security. Security is not having more than others. Security is having what God has assigned for today. Because God gives enough grace for today's weakness, enough strength for today's burden, enough provision for today's need, not tomorrow's fear, not yesterday's regret. Today, the wilderness revealed a truth Egypt had hidden. You don't need abundance to survive. You need faith. And faith does not ask, how much can I store? Faith asks, can I trust God again tomorrow? That morning, every family sat down and ate. Not with anxiety, not with competition, not with envy, but with satisfaction. And as they wiped the last crumbs from their hands, they learned a lesson the wilderness was determined to teach. God's enough is always enough. When God provides, no one is forgotten. When God gives, no one is lacking. When God feeds, everyone is sustained. And that same God is still feeding his people today. Not always with abundance, not always with extras, but always with enough. Not everyone trusted God. Some people looked at the manna and felt relief, but also fear. Relief because today was covered. Fear because tomorrow was still unknown. They ate, but their minds raced ahead. What if it doesn't fall again? What if today is the last time? What if God changes his mind? So they gathered more. They hid extra manna in jars. They tucked it away quietly. They planned ahead, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Fear always disguises itself as wisdom. It says, be prepared, think ahead, secure your future. But this was not preparation. This was distrust, because God had already spoken. And obedience always begins where fear wants to take control. When morning came, they returned to their hidden stores. What they found shocked them. The manna had spoiled. It stank. It crawled with worms. It became useless. Heaven's bread was never meant to be hoarded. Why? Because God was teaching them something eternal. You cannot live today on tomorrow's faith, and you cannot trust tomorrow without trusting God today. Yesterday's manna cannot sustain today's obedience. Yesterday's miracle cannot carry today's burden. Yesterday's prayer cannot replace today's surrender. Faith is not something you store. It is something you practice. Every morning, every decision, every fear. God was not being cruel. He was being kind. He was breaking their addiction to control. Because trust dies when we try to replace God with storage. The spoiled manna was not punishment. It was a lesson. God was saying, don't cling to yesterday, don't panic about tomorrow, walk with me today. And that message still echoes in every fearful heart. The fear of tomorrow can destroy today's blessing. But when you trust God daily, tomorrow will take care of itself. On the sixth day, God did something different. For the first time, the ground held more. Not because the people worked harder, but because God gave more. Double, not as a reward for perfection, not as a response to strength, but as preparation for rest. Because God never intended his people to survive by exhaustion. He intended them to live by trust. God gave double on the sixth day because he wanted his people to stop on the seventh. The Sabbath was not a burden. It was a gift, a holy pause, a breath in the wilderness, a reminder that life is not sustained by constant labor. God was saying something radical. You don't survive by endless work. You survive by trusting me enough to stop. Stopping feels dangerous when you've lived as a slave. In Egypt, stopping meant punishment. In Egypt, rest was weakness. In Egypt, value was measured by output. But God was undoing Egypt. From their hearts, he was teaching them, you are not valuable because of what you produce. You are valuable because you are mine. Rest is an act of faith. Rest says, I believe God will still provide, even when my hands are empty. Rest says, I trust God enough to let go of control for one day. And still, some could not stop. They went out on the seventh day, searching the ground. They couldn't rest because fear had not yet loosened its grip. And God's question was gentle but firm. How long will you refuse to trust me? Not because God needed their rest, but because they did. The Sabbath revealed something powerful. Provision is not only about bread, it is also about peace. God feeds bodies with manna. He feeds souls with rest. And the same God, who gives daily bread, also gives permission to stop. Because a rested heart trusts better, a rested soul believes deeper. And in the wilderness, God was teaching his people a truth we still struggle to learn. You are not held together by effort. You are held together by grace. Even after the miracle of daily bread, some still could not believe. Some still went out on the seventh day. They couldn't rest. They couldn't trust. They couldn't stop striving. The wilderness had not yet fully broken their fear. And so they went out anyway, searching, gathering, planning, as if God's command was a suggestion. They were still trying to survive with their own hands. And God, with a heart full of love, asked them a question that echoes into our own lives today. How long will you refuse to trust me? Not angrily, not harshly, but sorrowfully, because God did not want to see them suffer. He did not want to see them live in constant fear. He did not want them to carry the weight of uncertainty alone. God wanted them to trust him. And trust is not built in one moment. Trust is built over time, through repeated faithfulness. God was teaching them a lesson. Rest is not a luxury. Rest is a declaration of trust. And when you refuse to rest, you reveal what you really believe. The jar of remembrance. Then God did something unexpected. He commanded that manna be preserved, not to feed them later, not to satisfy their hunger later, but to remind them later. Why? Because God knew what the future would do. He knew that one day they would live in houses. He knew they would plant fields. He knew they would build cities. He knew they would eat without miracles. And comfort would slowly steal their memory. When life is easy, faith becomes forgetful. When your table is full, you begin to believe you did it all yourself. God knew that the wilderness was not just a place. It was a classroom. So he commanded them to preserve a jar of manna, a jar that would whisper across generations. You survived because God provided. It was not just a memory. It was a testimony, a living reminder that God's hand was real, that God's provision was not temporary. It was not a one-time miracle. It was a promise, and it was meant to be remembered, because future generations would need proof that God still provides, even when the sky is quiet, even when the miracle seems distant, even when the wilderness feels endless. God does not only provide bread, he provides memory, so that you never forget who fed you. You may not be walking through sand, but you are walking through uncertainty. Maybe your wilderness looks different than the Israelites. It doesn't have scorching heat or endless dunes. It has bills. It has waiting. It has questions that wake you up in the middle of the night. It has needs that return every morning like a recurring storm. The wilderness of our world is not always physical. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's financial. Sometimes it's spiritual. But the message is the same. And God still speaks to his people. Even now, even in our modern wilderness, he still says, I will provide. Not always early, not always the way you expect, but always enough. The manna was not a one-time miracle. It was a daily promise. And so is God's provision for you. You may not understand the timing. You may not like the process. You may not see the solution yet. But the promise remains. God will provide. He is not surprised by your need. He is not offended by your fear. He is not shocked by your lack. He is your provider. And he is faithful. The greater bread. And then, one day, Jesus stood before a crowd and said something that changed everything. He said, I am the bread of life. Think about that. Manna fell from heaven. Jesus came from heaven. Manna sustained bodies. Jesus sustained souls. Manna ended when the journey ended. Jesus never runs out. The manna was enough for the day, but Jesus is enough for eternity. The Israelites needed bread to survive. We need more than bread to live. We need purpose. We need peace. We need forgiveness. We need hope. And Jesus is the greater bread. The bread that satisfies the deepest hunger. The bread that fills the empty places in the heart. The bread that never spoils. The bread that never disappears. Jesus is not only our provider, he is our sustainer. When the wilderness feels endless, Jesus is the promise that never ends. When tomorrow seems uncertain, Jesus is the certainty that never fails. When fear whispers that God has forgotten you, Jesus speaks louder. I am the bread of life. The wilderness was not the end of Israel's story. It was the beginning of their trust. And your wilderness is not the end of your story either. It is the beginning of your faith. You may not see the road ahead. You may not understand the delay. You may not feel the miracle yet. But the same God who fed Israel in the desert is the same God who hears your prayers today. He is not surprised by your need. He is not overwhelmed by your struggle. He is not limited by your situation. He is faithful. He provides daily, not always in the way you expect, not always in the timing you desire, but always in the way you truly need. The manna taught Israel a truth that still echoes across time. God gives enough for today. And the greatest truth of all is this: God did not only provide bread in the wilderness, he provided himself. Jesus, the bread of life, came from heaven, so you would never hunger again. So today, in your wilderness, stop striving, stop hoarding, stop fearing tomorrow. And remember, God is not just your provider. He is your promise. He will feed you. He will guide you. He will strengthen you. He will never leave you. The wilderness is not a place of punishment. It is a place of preparation. And when you learn to trust him there, you will step into your promised land with a heart that finally understands. God always provides, and he always will.